What is up, guys? We are back with another episode, and in today's episode we're going to be talking about a topic that often gets just kind of brushed under the rug. It's kind of one of those things where it's like, oh, let's not talk about that. It doesn't really matter. It's not a huge issue, and we'll come into why that's the case in a second. But the topic today we're going to talk about is amenorrhea. Now, myself and Gary have talked about amenorrhea a few times on the podcast because it is something that you see a lot in the health and fitness world. It's very common, unfortunately, and it's also something, as I just said, that people they're like, meh, it's just not an issue. When in reality, it actually is an issue. It is something that we need to pay attention to, right? Now, as I said, myself and Gary have talked about this a few times on the podcast, but unfortunately, Gary is not here to join us today, but we actually have someone who is better at all of this stuff than Gary, who's actually more intelligent than Gary with all of this female related stuff. And so we're going to continue on the female podcast series that we're doing at the moment. And we welcome back Dr. Nicola. So Nicola, amenorrhea, what's the story there?
Yeah, so amenorrhea is defined as you've two types of amenorrhea. So you have your primary amenorrhea, so that will be girls who have never had a period, and then you have secondary amenorrhea. So that's someone who has had their first period and then has lost it for whatever reason. So the reason why we're talking about it today is that it's extremely common in the health and fitness world, particularly secondary cause of amenorrhea, which is functional hypothalamic amenorrhea, which can be caused by a low energy deficiency state or a mismatch in energy intake and energy output. It's extremely common, and the loss of a period can have huge amount of physical and psychological effects on a woman, and it's something that we don't really talk about enough. We don't know a lot about it, and it's something that is only really coming to the forefront now, and particularly the American Association of Obstetricians and Gynecologists. They're now considering the menstrual cycle as a vital sign, so counting it as your fifth vital sign, and that having a regular menstrual cycle should be considered, a barometer for hormonal health. So I suppose that's what we're kind of putting forward to today, and it's something that's extremely common, like we said, in the health and fitness world.
Yeah, and I think that thinking of it as a vital sign is actually really important to do, because the way I look at it, say for example, your hair just started falling out, right? You would be, oh, Jesus, okay, I need to go to a doctor. I need to look into this. Is there a cause for this? Is there something that I've done? Is there something that I need to do? Whatever, right? But if your period just stopped and you just stopped having a period, a lot of people go, oh, that's fine, And some of that's true ignorance. And I don't mean that to be condescending, being like, oh, you're so stupid, ignorant, you don't know about this stuff. But it's just not talked about. You could have, like most women, they don't have this perfect 28-day cycle. So if there's any changes to that, they might not understand, oh, well, this is what's happening, or this is why this happened, or this is the cause. Because female health, as this is why we're doing this podcast series, it's not really well put out there. It's not really well thought in education systems, like in school and whatever else. And you can be left in a position going like, is this just normal? Does this just happen? Is this okay? And then some of the solutions that people offer, even doctors and stuff, it's not necessarily actually solving the issues. It can be brushed under the rug, even in the medical community, especially when you come in with this kind of secondary amenorrhea. It can be like, okay, how do we deal with this? I hate saying it, the root cause is not addressed, and that's not a knock on the medical system. It's just one of these things that, it's very easy to slip through the cracks, right? So when we're talking about amenorrhea, there's also this other topic that's often talked about in the health and fitness world, which is this topic of RED-S, right? Relative Energy Deficiency Syndrome. I think it used to have a different name. The S was different, but either way, right? You'll see RED-S put out there, right? And we just want to put out there that these are effectively the same thing. When we're talking about this secondary amenorrhea, and we'll talk a little bit more about primary and secondary in a second, but when we're talking about the secondary amenorrhea, it is kind of the same thing as this RED-S that you'll see talked about. And the reason I want to make that or emphasize that is because there's actually a lot of research on RED-S. There's a lot of research on amenorrhea, but oftentimes when we're talking to a health and fitness population, they don't necessarily tie those two things together. And tying those things together really actually helps us understand what to do next. Because I don't want this, podcast, this episode to be just, oh, here's a topic, here's all the information about it, see you later. I want you to come away from this episode and go, oh, this is something that I'm dealing with. What do I do? What's the plan of action? Now, look, I'm not a doctor. Nicola, you're a doctor, but you're still not seeing the patient. You're not seeing the individual in front of you. So we can't give you medical advice. However, we can give you an idea of, oh, this is what the research says. Now you need to go out and either talk to your own practitioner, talk to your own doctor, or be like, oh, well, I actually need to make these changes. And obviously, I know a lot of personal trainers, coaches, nutritionists listen to the podcast. So you have to be able to see the signs, notice what's going on, and then also be able to help guide someone through this. Now, again, I'm not saying they have to be a doctor. You have to be a doctor if you're a coach. You have to know all this stuff, but you have to at least go, oh, this is an issue. This is something that we need to deal with. What's the generalized overview of how we deal with this stuff, So I don't know where you want to really start with the meat and potatoes of this episode, Nicola, but I'll let you take it from here.
Yeah, so that's a big thing. And even though I am a medical doctor, I no way, diagnose or treat any of my clients with triage. But this is important for not only people that have a medical background that are training clients, but for general personal trainers as well, and even for clients themselves to have a background knowledge of this sort of stuff. You don't need to, like I said, diagnose and treat, but you can be an advocate for your client and be able to, pinpoint, identify people who might be at high risk of amenorrhea, of relative energy deficiency. So I think that's important. Again, like we were saying, knock-on effects of health, whether that's, physical, psychological, and effects on performance. So RED-S, or Relative Energy Deficiency Syndrome or SPORT, it's a relatively new term. I think it was about 2014, 2015, and that came out, because beforehand it was more so known as a female athlete triad. And female athlete triad consists of low bone mineral density, either eating disorders or a low energy state, and then amenorrhea, or the loss of periods. So this was used to describe female athletes kind of back in early 2000, back in the 90s, who were suffering stress fractures, who were suffering menstrual irregularities. And so when they looked further into that, they were discovering this, relative energy deficiency syndrome, and the impacts, again, that was having on health and performance. So contributing factors of this are over-exercising. And this isn't, like we were saying, just specific for athletes. This can happen in the general population, and people that are exercising, particularly seen in like HIIT training, high intensity interval training, endurance training. So it's over exercising, and then teamed with inadequate energy intake. So you've nutritional factors with that, whether that's a lack of nutritional knowledge, whether that's lack of nutritional supports, or even a lack of motivation to have adequate nutrition. So let's say you're an athlete and you're just really maybe not, I don't want to say not that bothered to adequately fuel, but you might be of the opinion that, okay, well, if I eat less, then I'll weigh less, and then I'll have better performance, and I need to be smaller for my specific sport, or, dance, ballet, gymnastics, whatever it is.
That's the thing with that. This is the really insidious thing with that, where it actually works for some sports. Being lighter, it's like, oh, you actually see your performance increase, but you're at this double-edged sword now where you're actually seeing a performance decrease over the long term, or at least a stagnation of performance, because you're not fueling adequately. So it's very easy to see how it's a seductive thing to do, being like, again, like say you're an endurance runner, for example, you're like, oh, well, if I was a little bit lighter, I wouldn't have to carry as much weight and I would be faster when I'm running. And all of a sudden you lose some weight and you notice, oh, my fitness has improved here, my performance has improved here. But then we end up in this case where you're actually causing issues down the line.
Absolutely. And that's the thing. So that comes back to, maybe lack of motivation to adequately fuel, because being lighter is preferable in your sport. Then there's body image and dissatisfaction. So there's high rates of, body image and dissatisfaction in the athlete population. And as well, a huge thing is that sometimes losing your period can be celebrated in sport. You're working so hard that your period is gone. So there's a lot of social factors involved there. And then disordered eating and eating disorders, again, are very prevalent in the athletic population too. So there's a number of different factors. Then, we're also talking about stress. So that's psychological stress from the sport, and, external stressors as well. And then we know that high cortisol can be, a cause and an effect of amenorrhea. So these are all things that we need to consider when we're thinking about RED-S. So like I said, so female athletes, they were getting irregular menstrual cycles, they were having stress fractures. And so the female athlete triad was created. So subsequently then, why RED-S was developed to have it, I suppose, inclusive of males as well, because this is something that can affect men. Women have that early warning trigger of, lack of menstrual cycle, and men aren't as, I suppose, fortunate in some ways to have that, but they do still suffer with the same thing.
And it really is important to understand that this is something that affects men as well. Even though we're talking about amenorrhea here, like all the stuff that we're talking about, if you've ever listened to a physique competitor, male or female, you will basically see them describe all of the symptoms here. Now, maybe not all the symptoms, they're not talking about bone mineral loss or anything like that, which we'll talk about later, but you'll see them describe all of the symptoms. And the reason for that is they're basically subjecting themselves to controlled starvation, right? So they're subjecting themselves to this controlled, somewhat low energy availability. Right. And we'll talk about low energy availability a little bit more in a second. Right. But they get all of these symptoms. You'll see the women be like, oh, like I'm, whatever, 10 weeks out from a show, 8 weeks out from a show, and I lost my cycle, and you'll see guys say stuff like, oh yeah, I'm a couple of weeks out from a show, and like, oh, my like libido, however you say that word, they're like, it's just kind of non-existent. I don't really, I don't think about sex, I don't think about that kind of stuff, so they're seeing hormonal changes. And even people in the general public will know this. They'll have heard about this stuff before. They'll hear like, oh, dieting excessively causes, hormonal issues, or they'll be like, oh, like women shouldn't, train too hard because there's hormonal issues that can occur. A lot of the stuff that's put out there is a bit like pseudoscientific. It's correlative. It's not causative. It's not the actual cause. And we'll talk about that in a second. But a lot of people are aware of this. But at the same time, a lot of people are unaware of what's actually going on, right? And I want to make it really, impressive on people that this is stuff that occurs with men and women. Like, obviously we're talking about amenorrhea here because it's a very, like you said, an early warning sign. It's like, okay, you've got something going on, something has happened here that's different. What has changed, right? Whereas for guys, it can be very slow to realize, like if you're just like, oh, like let's say for example, normally you're like, oh, I want to have sex every single day, right? And then it goes down to like 4 days per week, you're not going to really notice, be like, oh, there's something hugely massively wrong here, you're just not going to notice that, right? Whereas if you're a woman and all of a sudden you're like, oh, I had this perfect regular 28-day cycle, and now all of a sudden it's not happening, or there's changes here, it's 6 weeks this time and something else, it's like you have a little bit more of an early warning sign, which is really beneficial. Now, one of the kind of, I suppose, annoying things as a coach for me as well, you see this all the time, is people will almost, like you said, not celebrate it necessarily, but they'll be like, oh, it's just not an issue. It's not something that really matters. Some people even say like, oh, it's kind of a benefit. You see this in the health and fitness world. They're like, oh, I just don't have to deal with my period. I just don't have to deal with that. And like, it's quite handy, and that's a very easy thought process to get in. I can imagine as a woman being like, look, I don't have to deal with this stuff. I don't have to, buy period supplies. I don't have to do any of that stuff. It's just, I can just get on with my sport, or I can just get on with my activities. I don't have to think about this stuff, and that's a very poor thought process because of all the negatives that we actually see. And we'll talk about those in a second, right? But before we get into that, unless you want to talk a bit more about anything to do with Red S, but the next thing I want to kind of move on to is like, what's actually going on? Like, talk us through this kind of like primary versus secondary amenorrhea, and then talk us a little bit about what's actually causing the issues here.
Yeah, so the one thing that I will say about Red S as well is that there are, screening tools that can identify, athletes that are at high risk of relative energy deficiency syndrome. There are, questionnaires like the low energy availability for females questionnaire. Again, these are all when you see this questionnaire, they're all things that you should be asking clients anyway, based on injuries, gastrointestinal health, reproductive function, but they are good things to look at if you are thinking, could my athlete, could they be at risk for something like this? But then, backpedaling to what is amenorrhea in the first place. So you have your primary and your secondary. So primary, like I was saying, is a girl or a woman who has never had a period. So that might be, genetic causes, that might be, again, eating disorders, low energy availability at that age. And then there's secondary. So that's you have had that initial period and you've subsequently lost it for whatever reason. So functional hypothalamic amenorrhea is the one that we're talking about most, which is associated with the low energy availability states. There's other hypothalamic dysfunctions as well. So functional hypothalamic amenorrhea is the most common, but you also have ovarian dysfunctions, pituitary dysfunctions, inflammatory bowel disease, thyroid disorders, celiac disease, etc. So the thing we're focusing primarily on functional hypothalamic amenorrhea, and really it's a diagnosis by exclusion. And you want to be ruling out all these other organic causes first. And this is something that I have seen with clients in the past, where whether they have, post-pill amenorrhea, or whether they've come to me and they're like, am I exercising too much? And then it turns out that they might have hyperprolactinemia or something like that, and that's why that they've lost their period. And so actually scaling back on their training and increasing nutrition might not be it might be just delaying a diagnosis of something completely different. So this is something, again, if you are a personal trainer or you are go to the gym, an athlete, it's not something to take upon yourself, and it is something that you need to work with the GP, work with medical professionals on, to rule out those other things before you arrive at the diagnosis of HA.
And that's really important because, again, this is one of those areas where there's a lot of, I don't know what you want to call it, poor, I was going to say pseudoscience, but it's not even pseudoscience. It's just poor information being put out. And it's very hard because there is we'll kind of discuss here, there's kind of a really clear causative pathway here. So you can get, again, seduced into thinking oh, I've got the secrets here, I know exactly what's going on. But there are actually other things that could be going on. And to kind of elucidate this, for example, you could have, we'll say, primary amenorrhea, right? But that primary amenorrhea could be caused by what we're going to talk about here now in a second, that low energy availability. You often see this, for example, in athletes who just, have been a female athlete their whole life. They're maybe a swimmer or an endurance runner, gymnast, whatever. They're basically doing a lot of training, and their whole life they have been eating a low amount of food because either their training volume is just, excessively high, that they're just not able to eat that much food to keep up with that. And as a child, even like a teenager, you're not necessarily thinking about this as much. Oftentimes you'll see people like that where they have stunted height, for example. Maybe you're the only child in your family that's the athlete child, and everyone else, your sisters or whatever, are, they're just free living, they're not athletes. And you're like, well, I didn't have the same growth development that they did. I used to see this all the time in boxing, for example. You'd see people that were really aggressively always trying to make weight, guys, for example, and they would just be shorter than their siblings, and it's because they're not actually getting enough food at these critical periods of time. So that's technically classed as primary amenorrhea because you never had a period. You could be whatever, 17, 18, you see this all the time, and they're like, oh, I've never actually had my period. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you have what is traditionally or commonly thought of as primary amenorrhea, like you have a genetic condition or I don't know, a tumor on your fucking thyroid or your pituitary gland or something like that. It's not necessarily that. It's actually the functional hypothalamic amenorrhea, but you were just doing it for so long that you never had your first period, so this stuff is very complicated, but hopefully by the end of this episode, you'll have a little bit more clarity in terms of understanding how to kind of navigate this stuff. Because what we're kind of talking about with this FHA, this functional hypothalamic amenorrhea, like you oftentimes see it in response to like dietary changes or exercise habits and stuff like that. So you can kind of more clearly see, I always get these words mixed up, an etiology or an etymology, whichever one is the right word. You can more clearly see what's going on here. You can be like, oh, this is what happened. We are now in a low energy availability state. This is what caused this. But even within that, there are certain things, certain habits that people do that, like, and we'll touch on it in a second, but in terms of stuff like, fasting, like intermittent fasting, you could be like, oh, I'm still eating enough calories, but they're not like spread out throughout the day. And then all of a sudden you run into issues. And this is very common in just the general public as well. Like, it's not even like an athlete or anything, it's like, someone will just be like, oh yeah, I only eat like, lunch and dinner, and I'm having these like menstrual irregularities and stuff like that. And it's like, okay, well, this could be, it's not saying it is, because look, I'm not a doctor, you are a doctor, but we're not, the person listening to this is doctor. And that could be caused by this low energy availability, but it could be something completely different, So this stuff is very tricky to navigate. And again, unfortunately, there's just not, like, I wish I had like a little guidebook that I could just give people and be like, do this. Oh, you've got ruled this out. Boom, go to the next thing, But unfortunately, we don't. That's why we're doing this episode. But in terms of that, let's go a little bit deeper into this kind of secondary amenorrhea. This functional hypothalamic amenorrhea, right? What's actually happening there, right? So let's say you're a woman here. You've been cycling, relatively regularly. There's always going to be abnormalities here and there, but you're relatively regularly cycling. And then maybe you are like, oh, look, I want to start dieting a little bit. I want to lose some body fat. Summer's coming up. I have a holiday book, whatever the reason is, right? You want to start losing some body fat, or perhaps you're an athlete and you just start training a little bit more, whatever happens, you make some sort of changes, and this could be a couple of months ago, could be a couple of weeks ago, but either way, what happens is all of a sudden you start noticing that, oh, well, actually, it's been 8 weeks and I haven't had a period. You start noticing that you've actually lost your period, and it could be just you skipped one, or it could be that, oh, like this is just a longer and longer time period between these. Either way, you start noticing issues. What's actually going on there?
Yeah. So, and this is a big thing as well that I speak to clients about, because I feel like we have such a disconnect about what's actually going on in our body. And even for us saying, okay, if you have, restricted calories or over exercising, you lose your period. Well, like, how does that happen? How does it get from A to B? How do those things interact? And it comes down to our endocrine system, which is essentially, a complex dance of a load of hormones. All right. So the best way to think of it is, so we're thinking about three main things. So we're thinking about our brain, our hypothalamus in our brain. Then we have our pituitary gland, which sits just below it. Okay. And these interact then with, in women, our ovaries or gonads, and then men would be the testes. And the best way to think about these is the secretion of hormones from one place affects the secretion of another. And the best way to think about this is like a domino effect or a chain. And if you have a break somewhere in that chain, it has a downstream effect on the rest of the hormones. So I know in previous episodes, we were talking about the menstrual cycle, and we were talking mostly about estrogen and progesterone. So when we're talking about hypothalamic amenorrhea, I'm just going to call it HA from now on because it's such a mouthful.
Yeah. Also, spelling amenorrhea every single time. I'm like, is it two M's, two O's?
No, every time I have to autocorrect it. Yeah. But so backpedaling from just talking about estrogen and progesterone, we need to think back to our brain, okay, and our hypothalamus. So our hypothalamus will secrete gonadotropin releasing hormone. Again, another like big word, all right? But when that's secreted, then it causes the anterior pituitary, so the next in the chain of command, it causes that to secrete LH and FSH, okay? So when those are secreted, then that causes the ovaries to stimulate our estrogen and progesterone, okay? So when there's a break somewhere in that chain, it causes a dysregulation of the rest of it. And that's how we, when we're not producing enough, LH or FSH, it has an effect on the ovaries. And when we've inadequate estrogen and progesterone, we have menstrual cycle irregularities. Okay. And even, backpedaling through that again. So how does the gonadotropin releasing hormone in the hypothalamus, how does that get affected? And that can get affected by, again, a number of other, hormonal modifiers and things that can affect our appetite. So like our leptin, our ghrelin, our insulin, those also, they have an effect on something called kisspeptin as well, which is a neuropeptide, again, that impacts our gonadotropin releasing hormone. And again, if we have a break somewhere in that chain, we can suffer menstrual cycle irregularities.
Yeah, and I often think of this because, again, I am actually stupid, but the way I often think of it, I'm like, look, you, as a woman, well, with a womb at least, you are trying to make that womb conducive to both fertilization and then also like have a child, right? So some of these hormones, notably estrogen and stuff, is making that womb conducive to having a child, right? And then you I suppose excrete, I suppose you would say, an egg. You're like, oh, the egg is ready. It's ready to be fertilized if that's possible here, and then you ovulate, right? And then in that egg, either, well, in the case of what we're talking about here, it doesn't get fertilized, right? You then get this rise in progesterone, you get this corpus luteum, fucking rise in progesterone, whatever. And that's then going like, look, we actually, we didn't get pregnant this month. So we actually, we built this nice nest, if you will, but we don't need it, right? So get rid of it. And that's effectively what your period is. It's basically shedding the uterine lining and going like, look, we built this up nice and, ready for implantation, ready for pregnancy, but we don't need it, right? So you get rid of it, right? So if we start breaking down the signals that lead to, oh, you have to make this ready for implantation, pregnancy, etc., estrogen, all those other signals previous to the egg being released and everything, then all of a sudden, why would you start, shedding the lining of your womb? Like you didn't build the nest, if you will. So we see amenorrhea then, right? So it's, again, you just need to think of that domino kind of effect, because people often get really stuck up on this in terms of, they're like, well, what's exactly happening here? Like we could give you the exact like map of like, here's your brain, here's all the signals that occur all the way down to like literally your period, but that's not necessarily all we actually want to know, because we want to know, first of all, well, what's causing those signals to change, and then what are the symptoms that are occurring when those changes occur, right? So that kind of brings us to the next step, which is what's causing those signals to change, right? So we have this normal, quote unquote, signaling from the hypothalamus all the way down, and we're like, right, this is the quote unquote normal cycle here, 28 days. We have it all, mapped out. You can look at all these graphs online, etc. But what happens to change that?
Yeah. So like I was saying, so when we have, so things like our leptin, our ghrelin, our insulin, and cortisol as well, they all have an effect on the hypothalamus and gonadotropin releasing hormone. So ghrelin, again, physiologically, that will increase, like your hunger hormone will increase when there's a low energy availability. And you'll see in people with anorexia nervosa, when they will classically have like really high levels of ghrelin, they will be amenorrheic. And then also, so leptin, again, is one of your satiety hormones, and that's found in your body fat cells. And the levels of that will be correlated to the level of body fat that you have. So which makes sense. I mean, the more body fat you have, the more leptin you have. So the more signaling that you'll have that you are full. So those are things that will cause that dysregulation. So we have either the low energy availability. So I know you're talking about kind of fat-free mass there, and calculating energy availability. This can also happen over a long term. So it's either something that, so generally when it'll happen over a long term, or it can happen during the day with fasting. And this is something, intermittent fasting is something at the minute that's such a buzzword, but a lot of the research has been done in men. So that doesn't necessarily translate over to women, and you will find women that are exercising in a fasted state might be carrying on their fast throughout the day and are finding that they have menstrual cycle irregularities as well. So it is something to keep in mind, whether you're a trainee or whether you're training a woman as well, whether this is the right thing to do for them.
Yeah, because this is something that's it's really important to understand. If I could even speak, there are a number of factors that play into this, right? But what it seems to be is the biggest factor is this kind of insulin signaling, right? And I hate when people talk about insulin signaling, because we often see it described as this kind of fat storage hormone. You know, people are like, oh, like I want to have my insulin as low as possible. And that's just a kind of really a misunderstanding of what insulin is doing, right? And obviously, look, we have all these other things that are playing into this, but they're also signaling through the same pathways that are affected by insulin. And what we really have to do before I get onto that is we have to think back evolutionarily, like why would all of this occur, right? And the reason for that is, if you are someone who is, you know, whatever, hunter-gatherer, caveman times, you want to be in a position where not only do you survive, but especially as women, that the human race survives, right? And I've said it before in the podcast, but like women are responsible for continuing the human race, right? One guy can get like 1 million women pregnant, right? So only one guy needs to survive, right? Now, again, genetically, not great. But as a woman, we need more women. Like if only one woman survived and 1 million men survived, the human race is not continuing there, right? So we need more women to survive in these situations. And as a result of that, hormonally, women are more sensitive to these changes to kick in these kind of like survival mechanisms, right? So in the case of having a low energy availability, a low food availability in the environment, like whatever, it's an ice age, it's a drought, whatever happening, right? Women are able to kind of survive that a little bit longer by doing things that are what we would think of as negative in the modern world, right? So they'll lower their resting metabolic rate. They'll basically like lower thyroid output. They'll stop moving around as much. They will like feel lethargic. They'll do all that kind of stuff, right? Whereas like me as a guy, like I'll literally fidget myself to death, you know? So that's why it's happening. But the signal that seems to be the strongest one is this kind of insulin signaling. Now, there's a number of mechanisms in terms of like the actual cell signaling pathways that this goes through, and we don't need to necessarily get into them because it's quite complex, but it's actually not illuminated in terms of what we need to do, other than knowing that this insulin pathway seems to be one of the strongest ones, right? Because it actually affects all these other things. And that's why I wanted to say, like, people often think of like, oh, insulin is this like fat storage hormone. And that's really not the case. It's more of an energy availability hormone, right? It's more of a sense going, okay, how much energy do we have available to us? And that's why it impacts on stuff like your like AMPK, right? Which is just that AMP or adenosine, I can't even speak today, AMP kinase, right? And that's basically just, we'll call it the weight loss mechanism, right? And it's kind of antagonistic to the other mechanism that we often see described in the health and fitness world, which is this mTOR signaling, right? Which is like, you know, your muscle building, your repair and growth signaling, right? And insulin affects that mTOR signaling, but it also affects that AMPK signaling in terms of it turns off that AMPK. Now, that's not perfectly correct, but it's basically turning off that AMPK, right? And that's then signaling a lot of other things to say, oh, we actually have energy available to the body, right? So when we're dealing with this stuff, we have to, again, think evolutionarily. We want to signal to the body. If we want to have a good hormonal system, we want to signal to the body that we are in an environment that is conducive to reproductive health, right? we don't want to be in an environment that's saying, oh, we don't have a lot of energy availability. And as I just said, one of those hormones that's signaling about this energy availability is insulin. Now we have all these other things, this cacophony of other hormones that are going on, like you mentioned there, leptin is also signaling about energy availability, because we could have a lot of energy available in the form of body fat, so that's obviously playing into the system, right? And that's not perfect, because we'll talk about it in a second, in terms of body fat it's not the deciding factor in this, but it plays a role. Same with cortisol. It's one of those things where, look, if you have to mobilize some of those fat stores, you're going to have elevated cortisol, right? That's beneficial. Like anyone who goes on a fat loss diet, they're probably going to have somewhat elevated cortisol to actually mobilize the fat. That's what we want. But in this context, if we have to mobilize fat stores, that's signaling to the body, we don't have enough energy availability. We need to mobilize fat stored for later, which is now, so all of these things, it's basically working through the pathway of signaling to the body how much energy is available for reproductive health, for survival, all of those things, right? And you mentioned it before in our notes. It's basically like a energy saving mode. That's often what it's described as, like, or thought of like, it's like, oh, we're going into energy saving mode. When you're if you have an iPhone, it gets to 20% battery, and it's like, do you want to go into energy saving mode? And it basically starts shutting down all of these non-vital processes for life right now. Like you can still do all the things on your phone. It's not like your phone just stops working, but it's not putting all the energy into all these, secondary, maybe, I need that process sometimes. It's not doing that. It's saving energy. And this is effectively what your body is doing. And the reason it's saving energy is because of this low energy availability, right? And when we say energy availability, what we're talking about there is calories. Like that's how we're getting energy. Like we don't photosynthesize. I can't just walk out onto my balcony there and stand in the sun and get a load of energy. It makes you feel energized for a few different reasons, but that's not actually giving me the energy that I need. The energy that I need is coming from the calories that I eat. It's the food that I eat, right? And as we've discussed many times on the podcast, like this kind of calories in, calories out balance here, this CECO equation, as it's often called, like we can see that, if it's energy availability that matters, we kind of have two things here. We have the food that we eat, and then we have the energy that we expend throughout the day, right? And this is when we're talking about this low energy availability, we're basically reaching a threshold where either the energy that we eat in the day is so low, or the exercise that we do in the day is so high that we reach this kind of critical point. And I'll give you an equation here now in a second, but we reach this kind of critical point where your body starts going, okay, this means that we have to enter into energy saving mode, right? And there's a few different cutoffs for this. And this is like, I hate giving equations because it's not like it gives you the illusion of being more scientific, but it's actually not that scientific. This is just, this is seen across the board, but it's not perfect, right? So we have this energy availability equation here. Now I'll probably put it in the show notes and stuff, because I'm just going to read out an equation, and that's not exactly great, right? But anyway, energy availability is equal to your energy intake, right? And that's in calories in this example, right? Minus your energy expenditure, right? That's what we're talking about. That's the classic, this is your CECO equation, calories in, this is your energy intake, minus calorie expenditure. That's okay. Are we in a deficit? Are we in a surplus? Whatever, right? But then that's divided by your fat-free mass. Now, your fat-free mass is basically everything except for fat, right? Because fat is not as metabolically active, right? So we don't really need to, it's kind of inert, if you will. So we don't really need to get included in the equation, right? Now, we want somewhere in a range of 30 to 45 kilocalories, if you're being more precise, per kilo of fat-free mass per day, right? That's roughly where it is, right? That seems to be energy sufficiency. Somewhere in that range, just 30 to 45 calories per kilo of fat-free mass per day, energy sufficiency. Now, I know people are going to plug in their weight now. They're going to go, I'm 70 kilos, blah, blah, blah. And they're like, oh, Jesus, I'm at 29 or 27, right? But this is fat-free mass, right? So we have to subtract the fat mass, which is actually a lot harder to do than you initially realize, because Do you know what percentage body fat you are? Do you know exactly how many kilos of body fat you have? No, of course you don't. The only way to find that out is, getting a cadaver and basically weighing the fat. So I don't think anyone's going to go, I wonder how much fat I have, and basically kill themselves and weigh your fat, right? Now we have other proxies we can, or we have approximates with like a DEXA scan or, an in-body, or, there's different methods to do it. But we kind of don't have a perfect number. So as I said, don't get too caught up on like, oh, I'm 29.5 here. Like, it's kind of irrelevant, right? But at 30 to 45 calories per kilo of fat-free mass per day seems to be energy sufficient, right? Now, this low energy availability state seems to be when you get below that 30 calories per kilogram of fat-free mass per day, right? Now, again, this is not perfect. This is not like, oh, I'm at 29 and I've somehow worked out my fat-free mass. I'm going to run into issues. Some people are just more resistant, resilient, whatever word you want to use, to seeing these hormonal adaptations, whereas some people, they're going to be at 35 and they're going to see issues, right? So this is why it seems extra scientific when you give an equation or whatever, but realistically, we just have to use what we actually have available to us, which is the day-to-day experience, but that's the cause. Now, again, putting that all into context, what we've got is we have a situation where if you're eating less than this 30 calories per kilogram of fat-free mass per day, you are now signaling to the body. That's basically an environmental signal to the body to say, oh, we need to go into energy saving mode, right? And then your body starts shutting down, not necessarily shutting down completely, but going into energy saving mode with all these other processes. And one of those processes is the menstrual cycle, right? And that's basically the way I think of it. Again, I'm stupid here. So I'm like, look, we have low energy availability. We're basically just hairless apes. So your body goes, ooga, ooga, okay, low energy, not time for having babies. Let's turn that stuff off, right? And that's effectively what's going on, right? Now, we could wrap up the podcast here and go, yeah, look, there you go. There's your solution. It's just a, low energy availability. See you later. But that's not actually all that helpful. There's a lot more nuance to this, so I don't know what you want to move on to that next, because there's a few things you've mentioned, but in terms of like fasting, for example, that we can get into now, or we can kind of save them for a little bit later, in terms of maybe we'll go on to why amenorrhea is an issue, but I'll let you take it from here.
Yeah, so like we're thinking about optimal health here, and we don't want to get to the stage. So just say a lot of women might be like, okay, well, I haven't lost my period, so it must be fine. But this is something that can happen over a number of months. So we do need to have this kind of in the background of our head. So like we were saying, kind of dieting for 4 weeks, for 8 weeks, likely might not have a huge effect on this. We're talking about it over a prolonged period of time. And then we're saying like, like we're saying fasting. So those daily periods, like, are we fasting for long periods of the day? Are we restricting key macros? And in HA, what you'll see with a lot of women is that they'll have a very low dietary fat intake. They might not be consuming many carbs, but might have a high fiber intake with that. So are they being really restrictive in that sense?
Just on that, if we again go back to that kind of thing that we're thinking about, we're going, oh, insulin seems to be the big player here, so that's not to say that we want to like prioritize foods that like spike our insulin or anything like that. But if we're eating a low fat, low carbohydrate, high fiber meal or diet, I should say, like that's basically the key here to like, that's what you would give to someone who's like type 2 diabetic. That's like, oh, look, you need to really like manage your insulin, or I don't have type 2, type 1 or something. You'd be like, you need to really manage your insulin level, and we need to just get things under control here. So we're going to really, try to suppress that insulin or whatever, so we're in a situation where people are doing the thing that leads to lower insulin levels, which some people would argue is, oh, this is beneficial here in other contexts. But in this context, it's actually the signal that then leads to the downstream like loss of your menstrual cycle, so again, that doesn't mean, and we'll come on to like what to do later on in the podcast, but that doesn't mean that you necessarily go, oh, I'm going to eat a load of, I don't know, sugar straight from the fucking jar or whatever. But it does mean that if we're trying to solve this, we need to especially get enough carbohydrates, but it also means that we just need to have enough energy availability in general.
And energy availability around training as well. So if you were just, doing fasted training, first thing in the morning, and then, just chugging a protein shake and that's it, and then you're not eating until 2 p.m. These are all potential issues. And amenorrhea again can be, masked if you're on the oral contraceptive pill or other contraceptives. And as well, something that's coming out, more in research is the luteal phase defect as well. And something, again, it's not as severe as HA, and might not be apparent until someone's trying for fertility. But again, it is still a menstrual cycle dysfunction. So it's essentially like a shortened luteal phase. So the second half of your cycle after ovulation, it's usually should be about 14, 16 days. But again, it can be from over exercising, like PCOS, endometriosis, that sort of thing. But you will have a decrease in progesterone, and the lining of your womb, your uterus, won't be as thick. It won't be primed for implantation, for the growth of a baby. So either you'll have reduced implantation or increased risk of a spontaneous miscarriage as well. So that might be something that's not apparent until way later on, until you're trying to conceive. So these things, again, are just something to have in the back of your head. It's not something to really scare yourself about, because like we were saying, it affects women so differently. And you will take two women, they both have the same BMI, and one will be absolutely fine on lower calories, and someone else might really struggle hormonally. And we don't really know the reasons behind that. We can hypothesize that it's due to, a lower lean, higher lean mass in one person in general, but we don't really know.
Yeah, and again, this is one of those things that, like, whenever I think about the human body or just life in general, like in terms of like living organisms, I'm like, there's so many things that can go wrong. I'm always surprised that things go right. Like it seems like the things going right are in the like minority of possibilities, but here we are. But what we'll move on to now, because I do want to make sure that by the end of this podcast, people get this kind of takeaway of like, okay, well, what do I actually do, right? But before we get onto that, why is amenorrhea an issue, right? Because again, look, if you're a woman, maybe you're still in the case of going like, oh, look, they're saying fertility, they're saying this and that. That's just not something I care about right now. Like you could be, I don't know, an 18, 19-year-old woman, and you're kind of like, who cares, So why is this something that we should actually care about, right? Like, are there any actual issues? Like, okay, cool, I lost my period, who cares, Like that's, again, a very somewhat common mentality to be in. But what are the actual issues around losing your period? What's it signaling? Is there any like big major issues, or is it just one of those things where it's like, oh look, this is just easily reversible, I'll just eat low energy available diet for a couple of years, and then like I'll just start eating more and it'll all be okay? What's the story there?
Yeah, so you need to think of this, that like losing your period isn't just about not having your period. There are huge hormonal consequences, and one of the most significant of that is estrogen deficiency. So this, again, you can see this in postmenopausal women, where there's decreased bone mineral density. So you will see this again in premenopausal women that have HA. So you'll see a decrease in bone mineral density, and again, whether that leads to fractures, and then further down the line, osteoporosis, and other consequences of estrogen deficiency as well. Like it has effect on our cardiovascular system. Estrogen is generally cardioprotective, so there's kind of twofold things there, and as well on lipid profile. So it generally, HA isn't associated with an increase in cholesterol, but there are some studies coming out that are comparing them, and again, that has a knock-on effect of coronary artery disease further down the line as well. So it is something to keep in mind.
Which is actually a weird one, because you often see people go, oh, like if you lose weight, you're going to see an improvement in your lipid profile. I can't even speak. You're going to see an improvement in your lipid profile, and in most cases, that is the case. I actually get this like like a slightly different one. Like my LDL always goes up when I diet, but then as soon as I'm back to energy sufficiency, it goes back to normal, but what you will see is, okay, you could see that initially. Like, let's say you get your blood work done every 4 weeks, which is excessive amount of blood work to do. But let's just say you get it done so you can see, oh, this is what's going on, right? Or even as a woman, let's say you get it literally done every single week, right? Right. Again, excessive amount. There's absolutely no need for that. But let's say you get it so you can see what's going on with your blood work on a weekly basis, right? Like, if you're in a dieting phase, you're in a phase where you're like, okay, I'm eating a lower amount of food. Like, you might see, oh, my blood lipids are improving. You might see your triglycerides go up because of fat mobilization or something like that. But in general, you're going to see your blood lipids improve. But what happens oftentimes you'll see in amenorrhea is, as soon as we lose that beneficial signal of estrogen, we start seeing lipid profiles like get worse, and people can be kind of shocked by that because they're like, well, I'm still losing weight. Surely we should be in a good position here. It was working before. But we have to remember that hormones are not just responsible for like, sexual development or, sex related stuff. They're really important for a variety of things within the body. Like you said, like, cardiovascular health in general, especially estrogen, really important, like as a neuroprotective agent, So we don't want to lose that signal, because that's basically the signal for our body, all our cells, to do different things. Some of those things might be beneficial, some of those things might be negative, depending on how you look at it, but it's still a signal. We don't want to lose it, because generally speaking, we end up with negative consequences there. Like, there's a reason your body is like, yeah, we need to produce this hormone or signaling molecule to keep these things running. It's basically like, if you don't have that, you've got some sort of like faulty electrical wiring here going on, where it's like, oh yeah, sometimes that light just doesn't turn on when I flick the switch. There's something wrong with the wiring. That's effectively what's going on here, where you've now set up a situation where, yeah, you're getting a little bit of estrogen signaling, but you're very low estrogen signaling because you're amenorrheic.
Yeah, absolutely. And like you're saying, cognition is a big one. And women that are estrogen deficient, and again, you see this in postmenopausal women, they're at higher risk for anxiety and mood disorders. Now, when you mention that, particularly to a premenopausal woman, and you say, okay, there's going to be effect on your bone health, your cardiovascular health long term, and your mood, they're like, okay, whatever. Generally it's because it's not something that's very tangible. They're like, well, I don't really care about my osteoporosis risk down the line. I'll worry about that later on, or heart disease. Like, that's not something that will happen to me. But then when you get into the other consequences, when you start talking about immune function, gastrointestinal issues, and we start talking about performance as well, so sports performance, that's something that people will mostly listen to. So particularly with sports performance, and like we were talking about Red S and the female athlete triad, again, they're really not too concerned at that stage. Like, they're at their the peak of their career, and they're really not thinking about their osteoporosis risk or their cardiovascular.
And also, like, they're athletes, so they're probably thinking, well, you know what, I'm an athlete, so I have better cardiovascular system anyway, so it doesn't matter. I have better bone mineral density anyway, because I'm doing sports or whatever, so like, I have some to lose, who cares? But again, it's kind of like shooting yourself in the foot long term.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the thing. But once you start talking to them, again, mood, they're like, don't care. But once you start talking to them about their sports performance, and like, actually, if you do have a fracture, that could, one, end your career, or you could be off for 6 weeks. Your endurance might go down, your power output, your ability to recover, then they kind of start listening, and that might be kind of one of the most things that might push them towards, again, increasing, taking better care of their energy availability, taking better care of the amount of exercise that they're doing, and as well, immune function's a big one. So, are you, or are your client, are you suffering from, kind of repeated head colds that aren't, explained, just, constantly knocked with that sort of thing? GI issues, again, it's very, IBS is so prevalent in women, but are you, writing off yourself or your client as someone they just have IBS? And then once you start kind of piecing all these things together, it's like, okay, well, they're suffering with GI issues. they've had, 2 colds in the last month, and now they have a stress fracture. Like what's going on here? So these are things that you do need to think about.
And again, even it seems really like, again, condescending, so I probably shouldn't say it, but like if you tell say to women like, look, this actually affects like your hair, skin, nails, all that kind of stuff, like all of a sudden people, their ears kind of pick up, they're like, oh, actually, Jesus,
Yeah.
I have been noticing that my hair feels a bit like more brittle. It doesn't have that normal like luster, that kind of shine to it. My nails they are a bit weaker, stuff like that. People all of a sudden start going, okay, actually, this is something that I need to pay attention to. Because look, as I said a million times on this podcast, Gary said it as well, like guys are fucking stupid, but it's very, and like I know guys, for example, will literally be like, this is why the guys don't go to the doctor even though they have an issue or whatever. Like they're like, oh, I'll just, that's a problem for future me, right? But some of these issues around being amenorrheic, it's very easy to fall into that same mentality of going, that's a problem for future me. I don't have to think about it right now. Or, that's something that happens to someone else. It doesn't happen to me, But then when you actually start seeing the consequences immediately, and they might be, minor consequences, you might be like, oh, well, my skin is not as good as it normally is. And, my hair feels a little bit more brittle. My nails are a little bit more brittle, like different things like that. You might be going, it's not a huge issue, but if you're able to correlate it and go, oh, it's actually caused by my actions. I'm actually seeing these different things. And like, obviously a little bit more like in front of you is like, oh, I actually start getting fractures more often. Or I start noticing that, again, like I'm constantly getting colds, or I'm constantly dealing with like, just if there's any sickness going around, I'm sick, like stuff like that. We have to realize that that's all related to this, it's all related to this basically energy saving mode. In normal times, you would put enough resources into your immune system. You would put enough resources into making sure your hair, skin, nails, all that stuff is in peak health. But you're actually not in peak health. You're in a state where you're in energy saving mode, And again, energy saving mode works for a while. You can be at that 20% battery, and normally, let's say your charge lasts whatever 12 hours. I'm just picking a number there. It's 12 hours, and then you put it in energy saving mode, and it lasts 16 hours. So you're getting a good few hours extra, but it's still a position that you're in where you're not actually able to do all of the things that a fully charged battery would be able to do. And the only way we can solve this issue is by charging the battery, which is food in this case. But is there anything else that you want to mention in terms of issues around amenorrhea? Because otherwise we'll just move on to how to deal with this.
Yeah, well, another thing I suppose is like oral contraceptives, and that masking amenorrhea, and again, just specific to female athletes in the oral contraceptive pill. Like you're saying, our menstrual cycle is a barometer of hormonal health, and if you have someone competing at a high level that's on oral contraceptive pill, it might be masking a lot of the issues that we just mentioned. So again, like the oral contraceptive pill, there's many reasons why women might go on it, and like the biggest thing is to prevent pregnancy. And obviously, if you're an athlete, being pregnant is not ideal. So it makes sense that a lot of women might be on it, especially if they suffer with heavy periods. But it is something that women need to be informed about. And like the oral contraceptive pill as a contraceptive choice needs to be an informed choice made by a female athlete. And in our notes, I popped in that there was like a survey done on nearly 200 female athletes, going through their knowledge of oral contraceptive pill and of not just the oral contraceptive pill, but of contraceptives and the menstrual cycle. And it was only something like, 16 identified estrogen and progesterone as the main hormones in the menstrual cycle, and then 18 identified amenorrhea as the loss of a menstrual cycle, and 88%, weren't aware of the differences between contraceptives and oral contraceptive pill. So it is a huge issue. And again, like we said, we can be masking all those issues that we were mentioning before.
And again, this is one of those things where it's a very tricky thing to navigate yourself, you know, because like you went on the pill maybe when you were 13 or something, because, you know, your parents or you were just like, oh, like, you know, we need to help regulate your cycle, and, you know, we want to prevent pregnancy and whatever other reasons, you know. But now you're in a position where you don't necessarily have as much of a being in touch with your own cycle. You don't know what the signs and symptoms of a normal cycle are, let alone one that's like, you know, we're reaching some sort of dysregulation here, you know. And again, as an athlete, this can very easily happen where you're going on the oral contraceptive for whatever other reason. You're like, oh, I don't want to get pregnant, or, you know, I want to have more control over my cycle, whatever the reason is, you know. But the key thing to remember here is it's not actually curing amenorrhea. Like, you might still have that, like, effectively it's just breakthrough bleeding. You might still have that bleed once a month. You know, you're on your 3 weeks of the pill and then your placebo week or whatever. You might still have a bleed there and go, oh, this is, you know, I'm clearly regularly cycling. I have a cycle, you know, but it's not actually the same. It's not actually the same processes that are occurring. And that can occur, that, you know, effectively it's just breakthrough bleeding can occur even in the case that we're amenorrheic, you know. So it's very easy to think that, oh, I have a cycle, I have the period every single month, I have to, you know, get all my period supplies, I have to do all my stuff, I have to do all the stuff that someone that has a regular cycle has to do. So clearly I'm in that camp, you know, when in reality you possibly aren't, you know. And this is one of those things that's very hard to deal with, because, and it's something that you see all the time, at least you see it complained about all the time, where a woman will go to their doctor, just their GP or whatever, and go, I'm having, you know, menstrual irregularities, I have amenorrhea, like I just haven't had my period. And oftentimes they might be prescribed, oh, well, we'll just go on the pill to sort that out, you know. And that's the exact opposite of what we need to do in this case, you know. And that's not to say, like, I'm not a doctor. I literally, as I've said multiple times on the podcast, I'm actually an idiot, right? So don't listen to me, right? You can go out and like read up on this stuff yourself. But I just read out a quote here from the International Olympic Committee, right? The use of combined oral contraceptives for the intention of regaining menses or improving bone mineral density in those with red S, which, as we've discussed, is just this amenorrhea here, is not recommended, right? And that's from the International Olympic Committee, right? And that's the consensus statement on relative energy deficiency in sports, the 2018 update, right? And the reason I bring that up is because I know a lot of people listening to this are either in the position where they're on the pill and it's masking the situation, or they think, oh, I'll just go on the pill and that'll get my cycle back to regular, you know. But, and it's something maybe we'll touch on in a second as well, is like, you can also have amenorrhea like post pill, you know, you get post pill amenorrhea. And this is, you now have a situation where you could be on the pill, mask your amenorrhea, right? Then come off the pill for whatever reason. You're like, oh, actually I have amenorrhea. You go to your doctor and they go back on the pill, you know, and then all of a sudden you have this, you go off it again and you're like, oh, now I have this post pill amenorrhea. Like, you can be hit a lot of different ways here, you know. There's basically no biological free lunch with any of this stuff, you know. So I don't know if you want to say anything on that, but if not, we'll get into this kind of how to deal with it.
Yeah, so like I like to think that people going on the pill to regulate their cycle, I like to think that that's a thing of the past. I know that it probably still does happen, but I like to think that that's just something that doesn't happen anymore. But like you're saying, if you are on the pill, it is monitoring for those other signs, like we were saying, like immune function. You know, if there's any niggling injuries that just won't recover, gastrointestinal difficulties as well, and like we were saying, so you can get post-pill amenorrhea. So the majority, I mean, like, you know, 99% of women will recover their period, you know, within the first 3 to 6 months. But if not, again, it's something that you need to go back to your GP and then rule out other causes of this. So like PCOS, like I mentioned earlier, like hyperprolactinemia, premature ovarian failure, those need to be ruled out first before coming to like an idiopathic, you know, post-pill amenorrhea as a cause.
Yeah, because I always think of it like, if I was to go on testosterone, right? Because this effectively the same thing. Like, if a woman goes on the pill, she's going on estrogen and progesterone, or estrogen there's a few different ones, but basically she's going on those female hormones, estrogen and progesterone, right? If I was to go on male hormones, testosterone, like that's what people do. They go on steroids, right? That's what quote unquote steroids are. Like all of those hormones we just talked about, they're steroids, right? But if I was a guy to go on testosterone and then come off testosterone, you often see this discussed in terms of like the bodybuilding world. People will be like, they basically will be like, yeah, look, I've shut myself down. That's the terminology that they've used. They'll be like, I don't get back to regular hormonal function for a while, and that's normal. Now you can literally go on steroids and just come off them, and I don't recommend this in any way, but you can come off them and most people will recover down the line. Right now, there's a lot of different things that people do, post-cycle therapies that people do to, ideally, hopefully, quickly recover that hormonal system. But in reality, it's still one of those things where you have been on exogenous hormones, whether it's, you're injecting yourself with testosterone or you're taking the pill. That's not, I'm not doing a value judgment here. And like, there's a variety of reasons. Like people go on testosterone for TRT, like they need it to function. Because again, these hormones, they serve many functions, right? But if we come off it, you can't just expect things to be perfect. Like you've been exogenously supplying these hormones. So stuff is going to be downregulated, dysregulated. Now, again, in most cases, everything will just come back online and, it's no big deal. But you kind of have to bear that in mind, that it does take a little bit of time before everything starts regulating itself again, and if you're 3 months, 6 months into this, like post pill, and there's still no period here, there's still you don't seem to have any kind of regular cycle at all, that's the time where you need to go to your doctor and go, what's the story here? Is there something I need to do? Then you could have like low energy availability and you could have been on the pill and not noticed that you were actually amenorrheic. So again, this is what we said earlier on, this stuff is very tricky to navigate. And I wish I had this like checklist, do this, here's your flow chart, whatever. But yeah, it's not, there's a lot to this, but let's just get back to this hypothalamic amenorrhea, because that's the stuff that, again, the vast majority of people listening to this, that's the one that they're going to deal with, because you're in the health and fitness world. This is the one that we see the most often, right? It's the one that's related, like we've been discussing, to this low energy availability, right? So how do we actually deal with that? What's the situation, right? Let's say you are an athlete, you're a coach that has a client that maybe they are amenorrheic, you're just a woman listening to this and you have amenorrhea, or maybe even you just have like menstrual irregularities, like I know a lot of women, once they get their diet dialed in, all of a sudden they're like, oh, well, I used to have like a very irregular cycle. It used to be like 4 weeks one time and 6 weeks the next and all over the place. And then they start really getting, especially energy sufficiency, they start noticing that, oh, actually, it's now back to just a consistent 4 weeks every single time, So there's a variety of people that this impacts, but what's the process? How do we deal with this?
Yeah, so first you need to think about, the treatment depends on the etiology, so the cause. So why has this happened? Is it down to disordered eating? Does this person have an underlying eating disorder? Or for a lot of people, it can just be accidental low energy availability and just like a mismatch in energy availability, so the output and input. So for this, particularly for things like the disordered eating, you really need a multidisciplinary approach. So someone might need not only their trainer or coach on board, but also maybe a sports dietitian, again depending on the person. They might also need a psychologist if there's a background of, again, disordered eating. They might need to do something like CBT to help with this. But generally, if we're looking at the more, like accidental, quote unquote, side of things, where you just, it's an unintentional low energy state. One, you're thinking about more food. Okay. So adding, a couple hundred calories a day, kind of 200-300. Again, this will depend on the person. But generally an increase of even 350 calories a day will see women regaining their cycle within kind of 3 to 6 months. Okay, so around about that. So one, more food, and then also eating more regularly. So eating throughout the day. So like we were talking about intermittent fasting earlier, so not having long periods of going without food, eating, fueling appropriately around exercise as well. And then we're also looking not only at eating regularly, but also not kind of just say loading our protein intake at one point in the day. So we focus so heavily on protein intake, either, kind of pre-post exercise, but for recovery, I mean, we want to have that protein intake spread out. We want to have frequent protein feedings throughout the day as well. Making sure we're consuming adequate carbs, that our fats aren't too low. Again, women are generally afraid of fat intake, but fat intake is important again for our hormonal health. All right. So we need to make sure that we're not cutting out any macronutrients here. Then we're looking at exercise. So our exercise, in intensity, duration, frequency. I mentioned earlier that, HIIT again can be, a very kind of stressful state on the body. So swapping out things like HIIT for LIS, just getting exercise, giving it more of a back seat. Now, food intake, calorie intake is more correlated with the low energy deficient state, and even for a lot of women, just increasing calories and, like you're saying, having the more frequent feedings can help them regain their period irrespective of exercise. But generally, it is a good idea to exercise less, to put it simply. All right. And then we're looking at sleep as well.
Just
So
on that exercise before we move on, because I will definitely forget it. Like, people will ask questions around like, oh, is there different types of exercise that are potentially better? Should I resistance train? Should I do cardiovascular training? Should I do X, Y, and Z? And like, from the perspective of this, it's often said that resistance training is a really good modality, especially for people that have disordered eating, because it gets them out of the mindset of thinking about burning calories. Because a lot of people, especially that are dealing with this stuff, they're in this mindset of, oh, I need to burn 1,000 calories in this workout or whatever it is, when in reality, what we should be focusing on, or what we could be focusing on, so you can still train, you can still push yourself and do all the stuff, is like resistance training, because then you can get into a mindset of, oh, I actually want to get stronger, which has the double-edged benefit of, first of all, you're not burning through a fucking 1,000,001 different calories every single week through exercise, but also it's showing you the benefit of fueling effectively, because you start thinking, oh, well, if I don't fuel effectively, I'm not able to increase my training volume or my training intensity. I'm not actually able to progress my exercises. I'm not able to get stronger. So it's a nice little double-edged sword benefit here where, oh, it isn't as calorie intensive, and it's actually teaching you that, oh, fueling is a good thing. And you'll often see this in terms of people like on Instagram or TikTok or whatever. People will come from a past history of eating disorders, and then they find the gym, and you might think, oh, well, this is just like swapping one disordered pattern for another. But when they get into this kind of resistance training paradigm, all of a sudden they're like, wow, I actually need to fuel myself. If I want to perform and I want to do well with this, I need to fuel myself. And it can be a really nice positive feed forward loop. So I just wanted to mention that, because again, I would forget it.
Yeah, definitely. And I suppose that as well is one of the reasons why I mentioned that you can regain your cycle by, not actually decreasing exercise like resistance training, and just doing a food approach. And as well, like, a lot of women who lose their cycle through low energy availability. There's people who love training. So taking away that again can be something that's really stressful. And like we were saying earlier, cortisol and stress again has an effect on our menstrual function too. So you might be taking away something, thinking that again, this is what's going to help regain your cycle, but again, you're increasing your stress levels in another way. So stress management, is a big thing as well. And then sleep again. So it's just for helping kind of decrease cortisol levels. So, whether that's, having kind of regular like waking sleep times, just like having good sleep hygiene, making sure you're getting enough sleep every night. But definitely stress management is a huge one, and probably something that's underappreciated as well.
And again, you have to think of it in terms of, even if it's just mental energy that you're expending, it's like, oh, it's psychological stress. It's just the stress of exams, it's the stress of whatever. Like that is still energy that is being expended, Now, it might not be a huge contributor, I'm not saying you're sitting there, and you're burning thousands upon thousands of calories just thinking. Like there was a thought process of that a couple of years ago where like they'd measure the calorie expenditure of like chess players. And they were like, Jesus, like they're just literally sitting there like thinking and moving a few times and they're burning thousands of calories here. When in reality, they were actually fidgeting around, they were moving around a lot more than was being accounted for. So yeah, you do burn energy when just by thinking and whatever. But when we're talking about this stressed state, like again, it is energy resources that are being used up, and that could be stress from exercise, that could be stress from life. It could be stress from, whatever the source of the stress is. It still needs to be lowered if we want to really solve the issues here, which kind of brings me on to just the next point, because especially related to exercise and diet when we're talking about this stuff, because they, in my mind at least, they're the two biggest levers we have to pull, right? Because the stress management stuff, like it's one of those ones that's really wishy-washy, right? And I wish it wasn't, but it can be very hard to change. Like I'm thinking of a client I have right now, like in their life, they have so many things going on at the moment. There's no way that we can just go, oh, look, just stress less, right? Like we can bring in stress management techniques, we can bring in or breathing techniques and whatever else, but they're going to be still stressed because they have X, Y, and Z going on in their life. And until they are finished, they're going to be still stressed. So it's a bit wishy-washy, but that doesn't mean we ignore it. We still have to look at it. We still have to go, okay, we need to lower that wherever possible. But what we do instead is we go, okay, we have these other stressors that we have more leeway with. Like you're in control of the food that you eat. You're in control of how much you exercise. Obviously, if you're an athlete and you're on a team or whatever, maybe you don't have as much control, but at least you have some control, right? So when we're talking about training, we can reduce training. We can reduce the intensity of training, especially cardiovascular training, and we can reduce the duration of it, the amount of calories expended. So we have a lot of leeway there. And the same with the diet, we have a lot of leeway there, right? And that brings me to this thought process, because you'll see this a lot in we'll call it the amenorrhea community. People that are in this community, this women's health community, right, that are talking about and trying to deal with this stuff. There's a kind of dichotomy you'll see in this niche, right, where it's like this all-in approach versus this like slower approach, right? And by that I mean, like, people will say like, I'm going all in, right, and they'll do stuff like completely cut out exercise, right, and eat a good chunk of calories over where they think their maintenance level is, right? They'll basically just eat with they're just like, I'm not going to restrict myself at all, right? And you'll see this kind of all-in approach, and that's actually really effective, right? But then you'll also see this slower approach, this more, we'll say, kind of constrained approach, where people go, yeah, you can still exercise, you can still do all the things that you enjoy training wise, okay, yeah, we're not going to be able to stop stress all stress or whatever, and okay, I realize you're a bit hesitant to increase food excessively, maybe you still have some sort of body composition goals and whatever it is, so we're just going to go a little bit slower with that. We're only going to increase like 200-300 calories, right? Now, I personally fall a little bit more towards that kind of slower approach with things, and the reason for that is I just think it's better long term to really build up good habits, right? So we can really keep good habits, we can really instill good habits by going that slower approach, right? But like you said, you still have to kind of commit to that kind of a 3 to 6 month time frame, because that seems to be what it is in the research, at least. It's that kind of 3 to 6 months. That's where we should start seeing some sort of benefit from all the interventions that we have done, right? Now, that all-in approach, that's not to say that that's bad. It's actually quite effective for some people, especially if those people have been very food focused for a long time. If they're in this position where like I hate the word, like kind of obsessed with food, like their whole thoughts are like, how many calories can I burn? Like they know that if they go into the gym to train, they're still going to be looking at their calorie expenditure. They know it's like, oh, like I need to eat 200 calories extra. Like they're still going to be obsessively tracking calories, and they do other like habits like, oh, I reduce my training, but I'm going to increase my steps. I'm going to increase my like non-exercise activity thermogenesis, you know? So for them, you know, we might not be able to get the buy-in, the actual results with a slower approach, which seems kind of counterintuitive. And with them, we kind of need to like wipe the slate clean. We need to start over. And for them, we just need to go all in. You need to reduce exercise down to like the bare minimum. You need to not even think about food in terms of the calorie or the calorie input. You're just thinking about, I'm fueling throughout the day. I'm eating, you know, 3 to 4 meals per day, spread out, an even spread of carbohydrates, fats, protein, etc. throughout the day. And I'm not going to restrict myself with calories. Like if I want to have a bowl of cereal or something on top of the food that I had, I'm going to have that, you know? So what are your thoughts on that? Because in my mind, I favor it. In most cases, if anyone who's, you know, trained under me or got coaching from me, they'll know I'll generally use the kind of slower approach with this stuff. And I call it the slower approach. It's more a conservative approach, I suppose we call it, right? But what are your thoughts on that kind of all-in approach versus the conservative approach?
Yeah. So I don't know if you follow Stephanie Buttermore. So she's the
I've
one
seen
that,
some more videos,
yeah. So she did the all-in approach. Now she's fantastic, but just like you were saying, she's someone that would have been, you know, tracking everything, you know, down to a T. And that's something that, you know, it really suited her to do. But again, I think it just comes down to the person. And I think for me, I would be leaning more towards a slower approach, because for a lot of women, it is more not an accidental thing that might be happening. So saying maybe to someone that's in kind of like a general kind of a gym goer who has also, you know, lost their period, kind of telling them, well, nothing matters anymore and just eat and don't exercise. You can be undoing a lot of maybe the good work and progress that you've put in, and you still can achieve really good results with a slower approach as well. And like I was saying, by even just increasing, you know, 350 calories a day, you know, maybe mostly from kind of carbohydrate sources, you know, peeling back on things like high intensity exercises and duration. So you can still be working towards a goal without just saying nothing matters anymore. But again, the all-in approach is suitable for like very specific types of people. And again, for just say like Stephanie Buttermore, like she wasn't working towards like a competition or like the Olympics. Or so if you're talking about, you know, an athlete, again, saying to them, don't train and just kind of eat whatever you want, it just might not be suitable for them, even in terms of their performance kind of longer term as well.
And just because you mentioned it there as well, like you will see this oftentimes in, obviously, like, you know, people that are prepping for bodybuilding shows, like women going for like physique, bikini, whatever it is, you know, they will potentially get into an amenorrheic state, right? And there's two things for that. First of all, I want to just emphasize, because we kind of actually just glossed over it earlier on, but the thing about that is it's not actually related to body fat. That's one thing that people say a lot. They're like, right, oh, it's the body fat. Once you reach a certain level of body fat, you know, you're going to be amenorrheic. And that's not the case, because you often see this in people that have like bariatric surgery or different kinds of surgery, and their food intake goes down massively, but they're still, like, say for example, they're still obese, you know, so they have a lot of fat, you know, it's not related to body fat, but they'll get amenorrhea, right? Yeah. So it's not the BMI. Well, to some extent BMI is correlated, but that's because that's generally correlated with energy intake, right? But the thing about it, it's not actually body fatness, right? That's not the thing that determines this, right? Like you can be low body fat, and as long as you are in a high enough energy availability, you're most likely going to have a regular cycle. Now, there's probably some, you know, point where it's like, you know, you're down to like whatever 7% body fat as a woman or something. There's probably some point, right? But most often it's related to the things you do to either get to that body fat or to stay at that body fat, which in general is a calorie deficit, right? That's what's happening, you know? So when we're talking about someone who has a physique competition, like it's this is a hard thing to manage, and something that you generally would try to manage with your coach. Like, you might be okay with the trade-off of being amenorrheic for the last couple of weeks going into your competition, because you're like, well, I still need to get a little bit leaner for this show, right? But regardless of that, you have to have a plan at the back end of that. You have to have a plan of, okay, well, how am I going to get calories up to maintenance? How am I going to effectively reverse out of this so that I can regain hormonal health and all the other health parameters, right? And the reason I bring that up is because that also applies to the general population that are dieting as well, right? You can be in a dieting phase. There's nothing wrong with that. Anyone who says like, oh, dieting in general is toxic, they're just wrong, right? You can be in a dieting phase. You can want fat loss. You can get fat loss, and it doesn't need to be like pathological. It doesn't need to be a huge issue, right? However, we have to have a plan at the back end of that, right? We have to have a plan of, well, how am I going to eat at maintenance? How am I going to eat at maintenance? Yeah, like I need to have this kind of, okay, I'm dieting right now, but the diet has a definitive end point. At some stage, it's going to be over, and then I'm going to increase food. So what does my diet look like longer term when I increase food, So I really want to emphasize that, because that's regardless of the situation, whether you're a physique competitor or like just generally looking for a bit of fat loss. We need to have those periods of eating at maintenance, calorie sufficiency, energy sufficiency, because that's what's actually going to fix this issue, right? And there's one thing I want to mention on that. There is a thought process of, oh, you can just eat at maintenance and it will solve this issue. And for a lot of people, that will actually happen, right? Like if you're eating within that like energy sufficient state, like you're in an energy availability and it's in that kind of 30 to 45 range that we were talking about earlier on. Like a lot of people will see a resumption of their menstrual cycle eating at that. However, if we're really committed to fixing this, we almost want to be just erring on the side of eating a little bit more than maintenance. Doesn't mean that you have to be in this like massive surplus. You don't need a 500 calorie surplus or whatever, but we kind of want to be going, right, yeah, we're not just like supplying this sufficient signal. We're supplying this is a great, really conducive environment to energy availability. And the only way you're going to be able to do that is by being in a surplus. And again, it doesn't need to be massive, but we want to be just above maintenance. Now, again, you can look at maintenance from the perspective of, typing in your data into an online calculator, and that's fine. But really what we want to do is use a combination of our energy throughout the day, how we feel throughout the day, how our weight is trending, which is a little bit harder for women, obviously, because you've got these menstrual cycle fluctuations. But fortunately or unfortunately, we're in an amenorrheic state, so they're not as impactful, So we do still have, fluctuations, but you can be in a position where you're like, okay, I've got calories dialed in to a point where my weight is relatively stable. It's in around the same weight. And then we want to go, okay, maybe we'll add 100 calories on top of that, right? Maybe 200 calories on top of that. And during this time, it's a great time to be focusing on like resistance training or something where you're like, I'm actually just going to go into this kind of like a gain-taining phase. Like it's really a bulking phase. You're kind of just like, I'm trying to actually gain a little bit of size. But we do also want to be wary of expending too many calories then in the pursuit of trying to build muscle, right? So it all comes back to this energy side of things. And as a result, we need to manage our training and our diet. But I do find, at least in my experience, I find like eating just a little bit more than maintenance is probably a better way to go.
Yeah, absolutely.
Fantastic. And then finally, we probably should say, just as a note, you could also focus on bone building nutrients, right? Because we talked about the diet, we didn't talk about like the specifics of it. Like it would, in the research, it suggested that like a higher carbohydrate approach is probably more beneficial, and that makes sense if you go back to that kind of like insulin is this kind of energy availability hormone. We want to make sure that we're really signaling that there's a lot of energy available. So we probably don't want to do something like a ketogenic diet, for example. We don't want to be on like a low carbohydrate diet. We want to be on a sufficient calorie diet with an emphasis on getting enough carbohydrates, like getting enough of everything, fats, carbohydrates, and protein, but just really making sure those carbohydrates are in a good place, right? But then we also potentially want to focus on like bone building nutrients, like vitamin D and calcium, because if we are dealing with something that causes lower bone mineral density, and especially if like say you're on the pill and you didn't know that you were amenorrheic, like this could have been a long time that you were in a calorie insufficient state, and there could be significant like bone loss there, right? So we want to make sure that we are trying to regain that stuff. And this is again why I generally encourage people to still continue doing resistance training exercise when you are recovering from this, because that's great for building bones as well, right? So that's one thing, just bone building nutrients. And we're really just talking about vitamin D and calcium. There's a million and one other ones that we could potentially talk about, but vitamin D and calcium are the main ones. And then the final thing I want to just note on this is, look, we're giving you this information as, oh, this is something that you could potentially think about doing, or do in combination with your coach. Or if you are a coach, talk to your clients, your athletes with this stuff. But you might have to get some like outsourcing with this stuff, right? And I don't just mean like in terms of knowing what to do, calories, macros, training, whatever, all that stuff. I mean, like, you actually might need some like CBT or acceptance commitment therapy, to actually be able to do this stuff. You might need psychological help. And this is especially the case if there is some sort of like disordered eating in there. Now, I did a podcast recently with Brian. It should be out already by the time people listen to this. But we did it on like just disordered eating, right? And there's a lot of things, a lot of tips in that are potentially beneficial. But even still, you can use those tips, but you're probably better off working with someone if you are dealing with disordered eating, and especially in an amenorrheic state. Because again, the longer we're in this state, the worse the health outcomes are to some extent. So we want to get this like resolved as soon as possible, as soon as we know, right? And as a result of that, there are some modalities that are beneficial for this, like CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, seems to be quite beneficial for this. I personally like a combination of CBT and acceptance commitment therapy. But that is something that you should definitely look into, because they'll also give you tools with that in terms of like stress management, and really helping you understand the underlying, like, oh, well, why do I need to lose weight, or why am I doing this? Because it's very easy to know what to do to deal with this, but it doesn't necessarily solve the reasons behind why you were doing this. Like, you might be like, oh, I just need to be a smaller individual, and you just have those thoughts ingrained, and just eating more is not going to get rid of that. We need to actually change our thought processes, and again, I've seen this a lot with a few clients I'm thinking of, especially now, where like we were dealing with their amenorrhea, and the key turning point was actually the thought process. It was more so that like, oh, I'm adequately fueling, oh, there's a reason for this, I actually feel better, my training is improving, and you actually see those benefits. And again, that's changing the thought process, and then they're actually able to go like fully in with this, like not to confuse it with the all-in approach, but they're able to go like, okay, I'm actually ready to commit to eating a bit more. I'm actually ready to commit to like reducing my training volume more, or like different things like that, But the one thing I want to emphasize again, because we did just talk about it a second ago, in dealing with this, like going on the pill is not it doesn't fix this, so it's not part of our solution, like plan of action. You might want to go on the pill for other reasons, but it's not part of our, like, here's the process of how we deal with this, how we get you back to regularly cycling, and it's not providing enough of a stimulus in terms of the estrogen or whatever to fix the bone mineral density loss. It's basically just masking the issue, like, because you can effectively get further into an energy deficit now without, you're like, oh, I still have a period, but anyway, is there anything else that you would like to put on that? Because look, this stuff, we could talk about every single nuance of this. We could go down another rabbit hole with this or another rabbit hole with that, because it is a very nuanced topic, and we'll probably create more content about this in future. Like I keep saying, like, I wish we had this like flow chart. We'll probably make a flow chart or something, so at least you have some sort of like, oh, do this and then do this, but that's all for the future. But for now, do you have anything to kind of add to this?
Yeah, so I think, like you're saying, we're really just skimming the surface, with this here, where we're giving, some tips, some pointers, and some things to look out for. And I think a lot of this information, for a lot of women, even kind of, talking about the pill, and a lot of women might be worried now listening to this, being like, I'm on the pill, am I going to have, osteoporosis now when I'm older? And it's something that if you are concerned about, talk to your GP about. But it's not something we didn't want to, I suppose, put the fear of God into you in this episode either. It is just something to have ticking at the back of your head. Am I fueling appropriately? Is my stress, my mood out of control? Do I have GI issues, immune function dysregulation, etc.? It's just to keep those taken away at the back of your head. And if it's something that you are concerned about, absolutely talk to your GP about it. Talk to a sports dietitian. You can chat with us, and we can refer you on if appropriate.
And again, the whole process of this stuff is basically you want to make sure that you're eating enough calories. Like, to boil it down to the utmost simplicity, like that's what it is. And that sounds again like somewhat condescending, being like, oh, it's so fucking easy to fix this, you just have to eat enough. But there's a number of barriers between that. But if you're just worried about this, you're kind of going like, I'm not really sure. The thing that you really want to do is go, okay, I want to spread my calories out throughout the day. So at no period of the day am I dealing with this low energy availability state, That's the first step, right? You want to then make sure that you're eating enough calories throughout the day, And again, you can do a calculation. I'll put the calculation in the show notes and whatever else. But you want to basically go, okay, find a calorie calculator online. Am I eating enough? Am I eating at least that maintenance calories that this calculator is telling me? Then we'll do this kind of energy availability thing. Now, you're not going to be able to work out your fat-free mass, so it's not perfect, but whatever. But basically, they're the two big things. You want to make sure that you're eating enough total calories and that you're spreading them out throughout the day. If you do those things, like, the other things are still important, but at least you've looked after the biggest lever here. You've looked after the thing that's going to be most impactful, right? Then you can start implementing the rest of things, because that's probably how we would do it if we had someone that's coming to us. We're going to go, right, look, I know you love training, I know you love X, Y, and Z, you have this stress, you have whatever else going on. The thing that we have the biggest control over is eating enough. So let's make sure you're eating enough. And then let's make sure that there's not like an intermittent fasting protocol going on or whatever. It's like you're eating from morning till the evening. You're getting it dialed in throughout the day, But anyway, look, we'll wrap it up here. We obviously still have a few episodes to go in the female health series. So look, if people are enjoying this, look, it really does help us when people share it online. They share it with their friends. I know people like, you're in like a group with other girls or whatever. It's like, just share it with them so that we're getting good information out there, because that's why we're producing them. Look, realistically, it doesn't really help us a huge amount to produce this content. It's not like, Nicola's got 1 million extra clients now. I've got 1 million extra clients because we produce these. Like, we produce these episodes because we actually want to help people. So if you want to help us with that mission, sharing it really does help. Share it on your stories on Instagram or wherever. Share it in your WhatsApp groups or whatever it is. The more people that view it, the more people that see this content, etc., the more people that we can actually help and impact. But other than that, look, we do still have coaching spots available. You can find out all that stuff in the show notes below. And other than that, look, you can follow us on social media. We say it every episode. I'm not going to go through the whole rigmarole again. Follow us on social media, YouTube and Instagram. They are kind of two main ones. So make sure you're following there. The email list, you'll get a lot of content that doesn't go anywhere else. So make sure you're on that. But yeah, look, you can follow us on social media and you'll see everything that we're doing. So do you want to wrap up anything finally, Nicola? Tell anything going on in your life other than that? We'll end the episode.
No, nothing big. Looking forward to the next episode. I think, what is it on? PCOS and endometriosis. So stay tuned. Yeah.
Stay tuned. Anyway, guys, look, we'll see you in the next one.